right, hello everyone. I will be presenting on the notorious confession killer, Henry Lee Lucas. So I wanted to preface that I will be suggesting a diagnosis for Lucas for his childhood as well as his adulthood at the end. So bear with me, there's a lot of information. Lucas was born in Virginia in a small one-bedroom cabin in the summer of 1936. His father, Anderson, was an alcoholic who had both his legs amputated from a railroad accident. He was confined to a wheelchair. His mother, Viola, was the breadwinner of the family and engaged in prostitution. She psychologically and physically abused Lucas, and Lucas reported that his mother would force him and his father to watch her entertain and have sex with her clients. Lucas also reported that his mother dressed him up as a little girl for 7 years of his childhood, and she referred to him as Susan, and it was supposedly believed that she was grooming Lucas to potentially pimp him out as he got older. However, teachers complained about this cross-dressing, and a court order was able to put those behaviors to rest. His mother physically beat Lucas, and on one occasion, she beat him so intensely that he was actually in a coma for 3 days. Lucas's uncle, who he admired, taught Lucas about bestiality and torture of animals. He would demonstrate it, and then he'd encourage Lucas to follow his lead. Lucas turned to alcohol as well at a young age, likely due to his father's consumption of alcohol and a way to cope with the abuse and neglect. It was then that his relationships with his siblings began to suffer, where he engaged in inappropriate behaviors. Lucas got into a violent fight one time with his older brother and ultimately stabbed. He was stabbed in the eye, and this created an infection because his parents neglected to do anything about it, and ultimately his eyeball had to be replaced, and then had a glass eye. So he also reported that he had been raping his brother as when he was younger as well. Lucas's father died when he was about 13 years old, and this is when Lucas dropped out of school from the 6th grade, and he kind of became a drifter at this point. He says at the age of 15 that he actually killed a young girl because she refused to have sex with him. He was in and out of juvie, and he continued to disregard the law and social norms well into his young adulthood life. Lucas committed an array of theft and burglary, where he was eventually convicted of armed burglary and sent to prison for 4 years. After his 4-year sentence, he returned home, and he was just a drifter, and he was wanting a more consistent place, and so he went home, but mom refused. She wouldn't take him in, and so this, I guess, really started this fight with them. She started to beat him up again, across the head, and at this point he had stabbed her, and she actually died of a heart attack, but he had been convicted of matricide. He claimed self-defense, but it was rejected, and he was sentenced to 20 to 40 years in prison, but he was actually released after 10 years because of overcrowding. So on to his later adulthood life. He attempted, immediately after he was pretty much released from 10-year sentence, of kidnapping 3 girls. So he was then sent back to prison for 5 years, and then he married his pen pal from prison, and he was physically and sexually abusive toward her. And then once his stepdaughter came out about him as sexually abusing her, that's when he kind of just peaced out and was like, I'm not going to deal with this. and ran off. And so that marriage ended. He continuously turned to alcohol and drug use. He was unable to maintain a job or any relationship. He did meet a man by the name of Otis Toole in Jacksonville, Florida, where they started a sexual relationship. And it was one of the only normal times really in his life. He was able to keep a job and that relationship with Otis. But eventually they got bored, supposedly, and went on a killing spree. And I guess, Henry or Lucas eventually started a relationship with Otis's little niece around the age of like 12 until she was about 15 when she supposedly disappeared. And a few years later, Lucas came out and confessed to killing Otis's niece. Her name was Becky, and also another like an 82-year-old woman who had witnessed that crime, supposedly. So this is when really the confession killer started to emerge, and he started off confessing to 100 murders. The Texas Rangers, he was in Texas at this time, started a task force to help solve cold cases, and they, were really onto Lucas because he was eager to really solve these murders. He claimed that God wanted him to confess so that families could have closure. It was suspected later that the Texas Rangers were feeding him information about cases because, Lucas came up with like a lot of detail, just elaborate stories of these murders. Later, he made a comment to a group of Japanese filmmakers that interviewed him, where he claimed to have killed people in Japan. And they asked him, how did you get to Japan? And he said, I drove there. So he had a lot of inconsistencies with his stories, and eventually that really kind of caught up to him. But his confessions were motivated by this preferential treatment that he received from the Texas Rangers while being incarcerated. He, got to get fast food, or he had strawberry shakes every day. I mean, he was pretty much free, but still in prison, but he had a lot of preferential treatment during this time, and it was mostly because he was confessing, and so he just continued to confess and confess. He was sentenced to the death penalty for one of the crimes that he had committed, and while in jail, he was considered this pleasant and cooperative person, and charming. Eventually, his lies did meet up with him, and this confidence scheme, or as a con artist, it kind of came to an end, where physical evidence started discrediting him. He couldn't possibly have been in two places at once. All of these things were coming out. And so now that he was no longer benefiting from confessing, he retracted most all of his confessions, and he begged for mercy not to actually be sentenced to death, or put on to death at this point. And because of all the inconsistencies, the governor, who was George W. Bush at the time, actually granted him clemency, and his life was going to be spent in prison for the rest of it. And so later in life, he claimed responsibility for his mother's death. But he still claimed at the very end that he didn't remember stabbing her. So that's kind of interesting. So the diagnosis I'm really coming up with right now, based on our book, is that Lucas meets more than 3 of the 15 symptoms of conduct disorder as a child, including starting fights, using serious weapons, being physically cruel to people and animals, and committing sexual assault. He also exhibited behaviors of lying, substance use, recklessness, refusing to attend school, and running away from home. These behaviors started before the age of 10 and lasted well into his teenage years. And then also for adulthood, Lucas meets all of the criteria for antisocial personality disorder. Characteristics such as failure to conform to social norms, absence of consistent truthfulness, impulsiveness, reckless regard for the safety of others, irresponsibility, and lack of remorse or empathy. He lived most of his adolescence and young adulthood in and out of jail, and he was accused multiple times of sexually abusing children and women. He showed little to no remorse for the acts and tended to flee when confronted by authority. He could rarely hold down a job, and his relationships and marriage were short-lived. Lucas pulled the ultimate confidence scheme where he gained the trust of dozens of people by confessing to hundreds of homicides. His lies regarding the countless confessions he made appeared to be more convenient for him at the time when he was receiving attention and preferential treatment. This shifted once he was found not credible and facing the death penalty. It was no longer convenient for him to lie. Therefore, he began to retract his confessions in the hopes that he would benefit from being shown mercy and not sent to death. I would diagnose him with conduct disorder as a child and antisocial disorder, personality disorder in adulthood later in life. He meets the criteria for antisocial personality disorder, including his history with conduct disorder. However, I do wonder about the significance of his beating as a child. The location of where that was at. Some studies showed it was kind of his prefrontal lobe there. So his decision making and all of that was very much altered. So how much does that play a role in that? How much does that play a role in development of a disorder? And, I believe that the trauma he's experienced significantly impacted where we're kind of led today with his conduct disorder as well as his antisocial personality disorder. But I don't know, what do you guys think? That's kind of what I've got. Thanks.